Well, hi, everybody. My name's Andy. I'm one of the pastors here, and I am excited to let you know that we're beginning this new series called Elephant in the Church. As you just heard, we're talking about 3 subjects over 3 weeks: sexuality, racism, and Islam. These are different subjects, you might notice. They're not exactly the same. We're not going to treat them all exactly the same, but there are some things we think kind of tie them together. And one of those things is that these are areas that we often, in the church, don't do a great job of talking about. Sometimes we're afraid to talk about it, or we don't do a very good job of listening and learning and loving through that conversation. We also think that these are 3 areas in our common life as a culture that are extremely controversial, you might have noticed. The reason they're controversial, of course, is because they matter. They matter to people. People feel deeply and strongly about them. They're things that sort of shape core things about who we are and how we approach the world. And so we think we should be talking about things that matter when we're in church. Because they're controversial, we've also noticed, you may have noticed, that when these issues come up, there tends to be a lot of shouting and a lot of shaming. And the church has been a part of that. So we're actually going to try to model a different way to engage in this conversation. We're going to try to make it something of a conversation. And we're going to try to invite some voices beyond just the kind of pastoral staff to speak into this, to kind of fill out the picture of what it means to be a Christian and engaging in these issues. The other thing we think that these 3 topics share is that they all matter a lot to Jesus. That he has something to say about them, and so we're going to be talking about these things while also keeping in the forefront of our minds what it is that Jesus has said and done, and how his life and death and resurrection should inform the way we approach these issues and how we talk about them. The last thing that I can say about all 3 of these sermons is that we're going to miss a lot. There's no way that we can kind of comprehensively cover these 3 subjects in one sermon over 3 weeks. However, if we waited until we sort of had it all tied down and we felt like we were ready, or that we had were able to kind of comprehensively cover these subjects, we would be waiting forever, right? We would never do it. I don't know if you've heard how you eat an elephant, but you eat it 1 bite at a time. And so that's what we're going to do this morning. We are going to just take a bite and begin a conversation that we hope continues. We can't cover everything right in this hour, so we've planned following week follow-up conversations at 9 o'clock in the courtyard room. If you want to dig deeper, if you want to learn more, if you want to ask questions, if you want to just engage in further conversation, come next week at 9 o'clock, and we'll be talking about this sermon next week, and so on for each following week. There's also on the website some study guide questions for your small group or your family. There's some supplemental resources we've provided for you, and there's a place for you to submit some questions that we can then cover next week. So we really genuinely hope this is a part of the beginning of a longer and bigger and really meaningful conversation. So, this morning, the elephant in the room, the elephant in the church, is sexuality. And more specifically, the elephant is that the Christian faith has presented a vision from the Bible of sexuality in which God's intention for sexuality is that it be expressed between a man and a woman in the context of marriage. This is something that the vast majority of Christians have believed throughout time and across the world. Until very recently, it's become a tension point with our culture, right? That vision of sexuality doesn't necessarily match up with the vision of sexuality that we may hear about in the world or that we may feel in our own hearts. So I am imagining that the squirming has already begun. And some of you are are squirming because you think you know where this is going. And some of you are squirming because you are thinking about where you've been. And for all of us, I just want to say, I know that this topic of sexuality is a sensitive one. It's a tender subject area. And so we want this to be a grace-filled and gentle kind of conversation. So let's all, myself included, take kind of a deep breath. To help me in this conversation, I want to invite up my good friend, Janice McWilliams, who many of us know. She was just up here preaching the other week. You may not know that Janice is you can have a seat. I'm going to talk about you for just a second. Janice has a couple day jobs that made us think she'd be a great person to share this conversation with. She is a counselor, licensed therapist, and she is a spiritual director, and she also is on staff with InterVarsity and has done training on the subject of sexuality with InterVarsity staff. So, Janice, thank you for being here.
You're welcome.
I'm glad you do a lot of work with anxiety and stress.
Yes.
And that's good because
we're having some.
I was thinking that I have this pastor anxiety dream sometimes where I'm doing something really important in my dream, like a wedding or a funeral, and I'm feeling unprepared, and I kind of don't know where it's going to go. And I feel like you have stepped into my nightmare.
And you mine.
So thank you
I'm
for
glad.
being here.
I'm glad to be here. I think it's important what we're doing. So.
One of the things that, as we just dive right into this, in your work during the week, as you're counseling people, as you're talking with folks, there are a couple areas where you help people work through struggles that they experience in this area of sexuality. And so I'm wondering if you would just begin by helping frame for us what are some of the tensions that you see us facing from where you sit on this subject.
Well, I mean, as kingdom people, the tension between the difference in the biblical sexual ethic and the culture's current sexual ethic is just vast. And I mean, the way I would see it, like one way of describing it in the culture is that any sexual desire should be explored, experimented with, and indulged and expressed. And so that's what is getting communicated to us left and right. And people even go so far as to say, you're going to be really psychologically unhealthy if you don't do all those things. Mm-hmm. And I hear that in my professional circles. People talking about what a tragedy it is that someone's only had one sexual partner, for instance, or naive, or how you can't possibly know anything about your sexual power unless you have followed through and lived it out in sexual expression. Things that I just feel like have been really dicey conversations to have in those circles. In the kingdom view, I feel like we've lost the lens through which to look at this, and I think the ethic in the Christian worldview is one of chastity, and that's an old word that I feel like is very unpopular. Do you guys use that very much or hear about that? I mean, I don't, but I feel like it's a helpful word because it's a word that reflects a virtue of restraint and moderation, in this case of sexual desire. And so you can see how completely opposite that is from the world, saying explore, express, and this view of chastity is one of moderating and potentially abstaining, moderating, and containing. So
one of the tension points is that it's not just that we sort of have there are different conceptions of sort of sexuality and what's healthy, but that they're almost kind of divergent. Like if you don't, you're not like fully human almost if you aren't experiencing the fullness of sexual possibility.
Right. And we forget, because we're so surrounded by the culture as kingdom people, we even forget this other view. I mean, the thing that I always come back to, and I almost kind of forget, is that Jesus was actually single and not living expressed sexuality, like we're talking about, and he's our model. Like we have permission to marry and stuff, but that's even the chastity that he lived, we even forget exists.
Jesus is, if that's true, then Jesus didn't live a fully human life.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So are there ways that sort of the cultural moment here, we're talking about some of the tension points, but are there ways that actually it's been helpful?
Yeah. I mean, I think so, because I think the church has been so timid or shy about really voicing and exploring a lot of the sexual tensions. The culture has actually been helpful in this present expression of what's happening, in naming and bringing to light some of the internal realities that people face. And so it lifts some of the shame of it, to know that you're not the only one, and to know that this is something that people see and understand as realities. And so that's been really helpful. Where I feel like it hasn't been so helpful, a couple of ways, is that I think that we're introducing sexuality awfully early to people, to kids, before they're really kind of ready to understand all the breadth of expressions. But also, there's so much pressure on people now that if you can't be fully human unless you're expressing it and exploring and diving into all these sexual movements inside, then there's all this pressure to be sexually attractive, sexually experienced, and have a lot of kind of skills and ability. And this becomes a crushing weight for people.
Yeah. I imagine that weight. I mean, one of the things, as we've kind of kicked around this subject in conversation, we've talked about how many different ways this works itself out in people's lives, this weight or this tension. Can you talk a little bit about sort of how you see that working out as people bear these burdens?
Right, and I think this is one of the things that makes it really hard to kind of talk about in the church. But there are people who everyone has a sexual tension story. I would say no one is immune to experiencing some kind of tension around their own sexuality, either what they feel inside or what has happened to them. But some people have, like, what I would call relatively small sexual tension stories. So, like, let's say you grow up in a Christian home, your parents are together, no one's ever been sexually harmed in your life, and you're kind of growing along through adolescence. So maybe at one point you feel kind of overweight or out of shape or ugly, but you're really not any of those things, but you go on a diet or something like this. There's a little bit of tension, right? Or you don't have a date for homecoming, but you do have one for prom. So there are tensions that come up, rejections or pains, but they're small, and they're made up for in summer camp when somebody has a crush on you, and then you go to college and you meet someone your junior year that's perfectly lovely, who comes from an attacked home and has not been harmed sexually in any way, and then the two of you get married and you explore with great tenderness and openness your own sexual relationship for many years. You never fall out of love. No one is ever harmed. And then you die in your sleep on the same night when you're 85 years old.
Yeah. I think that's pretty common.
Yeah. Okay, I would call that like a small tension story. Now, bigger tension stories are just not like that at all. I mean, bigger tension stories end up being stories like prolonged, unwanted singleness, broken, devastated marriages where there is no sexual expression in the marriage. It's stories of being harmed sexually, of being abused. It's stories of unwanted pregnancies, of feeling like you hate your body or you don't fit in your body, of having attraction to the same sex, of having sexual addiction to pornography and masturbation or other kinds of sexual addictions. The realities of these pains are big tension stories. And the people with the small tension stories can't really say, oh, I know exactly what you're going through, when you have a big tension story, because, frankly, you don't.
Right.
And these tensions are experienced and held so differently. They're not, evenly distributed, and that can feel so unfair.
Yeah.
And I think it's one of the products of living in a broken world.
Yeah. That really makes sense to me as to why it's hard for us to talk about in the church, because we all experience these tensions, but we experience them in different ways. And so when one person is talking about it, that lands with someone else or weighs on them in a really different way.
Yeah.
We've talked about how there's this moment, this beautiful moment in Scripture where Jesus is presented with this situation of great sexual tension. And so I wonder if we can just talk about that for a minute. And if anybody happens to be eavesdropping,
Just listen in.
yeah, if they're just listening to our little chat, they can find this in John chapter 8.
Oh my gosh, John 8, I love that.
Yeah, it's great. It might also be on the screens floating behind us as well. This is actually one of my most favorite moments in Scripture, and it just starts in verse 2, where at dawn Jesus appears again in the temple courts, where all the people gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now, what do you say?" They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. So let me just pause right there and ask you for your observations about what's happening right now.
I mean, well, first of all, this woman who's been caught in the act of adultery and who's being brought forward, I realize that there's no man being brought forward as well. I mean, adultery, sort of two-person situation. And yet the woman is singled out and brought into this story because I think they feel like they have a better case, bringing her forward. I also just think about what this must be like for her. She's obviously just been ripped out of a very humiliating situation, and how she's even brought. I mean, I wonder, like, is she covered? What is she wearing? And they're bringing her to this public place and using her as kind of this symbol in order to trap Jesus. So she's being horribly used.
Yeah.
And she's very humiliated and exposed.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, she's probably afraid for her life.
Right.
So I mean, I just think it's a horrible situation.
This is like a real nightmare scenario, actually.
Yeah.
This is in a way what we're all most deeply afraid of, is
Right.
that something that is shameful or that we don't want anyone to know about is like put out in public view.
Yeah.
And I think you're right. She's being used so that the Pharisees can make their point,
Right.
So that they can sort of figure out where Jesus lands on this particular issue. And so they invariably oversimplify things, right? I mean, as you pointed out, adultery, as I understand it, is kind of a two-person thing, and they're acting like they care about the Bible,
Right.
but they really aren't, and they don't care about this woman. All they care about is being right and figuring out which side of this Jesus is on.
Yeah.
And I actually think, for me, that reminds me a lot of the way our cultural conversation goes.
Oh, absolutely.
That it's like you either have to be on this side or that side. There's no room in the middle. And even for the church, sometimes it feels like you need to it's either you're marching in the pride parade or you are protesting the pride parade. Those are the only options that seem to be in front of us. And so that's another way that I think this conversation just gets oversimplified, and people are dehumanized
Yeah.
in the midst of it.
Yep. And I think that's what we see today in social media,
Yeah.
and the way these tender issues are addressed. It's either you're, just like you're saying, you're this or you're that, and people are getting horribly hurt because
Right.
of that.
So we have not just a public shaming, but actually bringing this tension to Jesus. So all of those big tension stories that you just named, this is like the guy who can't stop looking at porn at work all of a sudden being found out. This is the teenager who's trying to figure out how to tell his parents that he thinks he might be gay. All of that is in this moment presented to Jesus. And so it's let's see what Jesus does. So he bends down and started to write on the ground with his finger. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "Let any of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." Again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. At this, those who heard began to go away, one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left, with the woman still standing there. Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir," she said. "Then neither do I condemn you," Jesus declared. "Go now and leave your life of sin." So what do you think is remarkable about this?
Well, in talking about the way our culture seems to kind of shove everyone into one camp or another, and that's what the Pharisees are trying to do here. One thing I just love about how Jesus responds is that he just won't let them do that.
Yeah.
Right? They want to get an answer out of him, like, is it right that we can stone this woman because she broke the law of Moses? And Jesus kind of, I'm not going to get stuck in that.
He sees what's going
right,
on.
right.
Yeah.
He comes out of it and he approaches it this whole different way, and then invites them to, into this reflection themselves, which leads in them all departing. The other thing I just love about it is when he goes and he writes in the sand, in the dirt. People have talked, volumes about what is he writing down there. So we'll leave that to your lunchtime discussion, what he was writing. But the function of him writing like that draws the attention away from this woman and to what he's doing.
Yep.
And so even just the mercy in that and the kindness of that Jesus is drawing people's, just even their eyes and their attention away from her while she's standing there humiliated, really moves me, because he's like, I'm taking this on myself right now.
Right. He both sort of steps out of the debate and steps in at the same time in a way that literally ends up saving this woman's life in a very literal way. I also love how he invites the Pharisees into kind of responsibility about what they're actually saying, and reflection, as you mentioned, on their own lives. And he kind of says, like, okay, whoever is innocent here can render this verdict.
Right.
So that calls them into sort of like, this all of a sudden isn't just an issue debate. They actually have responsibility in how this goes. And what's kind of amazing about this in a bigger sense is that we know that Jesus is actually the only innocent one.
Right.
And he renders the verdict. And that is a verdict of not condemned. This does not define you. This isn't the end of you, he says to this woman. He kind of looks at her and addresses her, and if she's been dehumanized, he sort of rehumanizes her, treats her as a person, and kind of says this amazing statement, which is, I don't condemn you, and you don't have to keep living this way.
Yeah.
Like, this isn't this story that you brought to me of tension isn't the story that defines you now or needs to define your future.
Yeah.
It's kind of amazing to think about how different these two approaches are between the Pharisees and Jesus. And sadly, I think maybe we in the church are much more like the Pharisees than Jesus here. So what, given what we're seeing here, what do you think the messages are for us as individuals and for us as a church as we navigate these things?
I think part of the mercy of Jesus turning then and interacting with the woman at the end, he really is then, like you were saying, coming back to her and saying, this story is not too big for me. I'm going to look at you with kindness. I'm not going to condemn you, but I'm going to send you on your way to live a new life. So what I love about this story for us is to kind of understand the order of events.
Yeah.
So the woman, she's unwillingly brought to this situation, but she very quickly has an encounter with Jesus that is dealing with her shame. It is saving her life, and that's the starting place.
Yep.
So she's starting with, oh my goodness, before the interaction happens, where Jesus really kind of interacts with her, her life has been saved by Jesus. So she's in this place of encounter with Jesus, which is very powerful and very transformative. And then Jesus interacts with her and basically says, I don't condemn you, but go and live a new life.
Yeah.
You can actually live differently than this. And so the guidance or the ethic comes after the encounter. Right?
Right.
Now, what we tend to do, and what I think the culture tries to force us to do, is to lead with the ethic, which makes no sense. I mean, the ethic is gobbledygook without the interaction with Jesus first.
Right.
Like, why would anybody live this ethic if they had not had a sense of, I might die, I'm full of shame, I have been completely saved and rescued by the Savior, and then let's talk about my life.
That's a game changer.
Right. You can't, but starting with the ethic just feels cruel. I mean, starting with the ethic just feels arbitrary.
Right.
Whereas starting with the encounter with Jesus, then everything's different.
Yeah. And so often I think what the church maybe tends to do, or as you said, is sometimes put upon us, is this sense of expecting people who haven't encountered Jesus to live in the way of Jesus.
Right. And to understand that makes sense.
Yeah.
Which...
That would actually lead us, I think, more to just sort of rule-following behavior ethic, like do this, don't do this, rather than kind of understanding that Jesus has acted to save us. Yeah. And then that sort of changes what our past and what our future means. I mean, we touched on this in the last kind of question, but it strikes me that with this statement that Jesus ends with of, you are not ruined, you can live a meaningful life even out of this terrible encounter and a difficult past. I mean, I think there's an invitation for us in all of our experiences of small or large sexual tension to see how Jesus handles it here. It's not too big for him.
Right.
He's not freaking out. He's not horrified. He actually is taking the shame on himself. Like we see that happening here. He's taking the shame on himself, and he's transforming the situation. He's inviting something new and new possibilities. And so, I think there's this message to us. Okay, so if it's not just about issues and it's about people, then all of us with our sexual tension need to hear a good invitation from Jesus here out of this text to I can handle this. I am big enough to handle this, and you can bring that tension and not fear condemnation, but you can look for a new beginning.
Right.
It also strikes me just at a church level that there's a kind of a new tension that Jesus invites us into almost, but it's a good tension, not a bad one. And it's because it's not like Jesus is pro-adultery here. That's not the point he's trying to make. It doesn't matter. Whatever you want to do is fine. He doesn't, and at no point in his ministry does he relax the sort of sexual ethic that the Jewish people had. In fact, in certain ways, he strengthens it. He says adultery isn't just a matter of your action, but it's also a matter of your heart and your thoughts. So it's not like Jesus is anything goes here. But so he has this sexual vision, this sexual ethic that he wants us to experience this in the way that God intended it to. But it's all about how it's administered and communicated, and the way that people are met in their brokenness is something that I think we as a church have a lot to learn. How do we manage that tension of saying, here's what God is asking of us, or here's how God intended this to be, and here's where we all are in some messy tension brokenness. And so how do we hold both of those things gently and compassionately and with grace in such a way that we actually can be a people where these sexual tensions don't need to be hidden, where we don't have to like shove it down and worry what would happen if people really knew.
Right. I mean, I think just we could talk about that for a really long time, but a couple of thoughts that really do come to me are just learning to be listeners, learning what it means to bring each other to Jesus, to meaningfully have that encounter with Jesus, because it's not like, we only need that one time.
Right.
It's over and over again, we need the encounter with Jesus to make sense of the ethic. And for us to be able to be a community that kind of understands that and does that, walks with each other in that. I mean, one thing I think is important to keep in mind is just the ongoing kind of journey that I think bringing our sexual tension stories into relationship with Jesus looks like. One visual for myself that's been really helpful is like, if this is your sexual tension story, there are going to be times in your life when it is right here, like everything you see and experience is mediated through your sexual tension story, because it's just so live, it's so raw, and so opened up. And in those times, I feel like there's an invitation from Jesus to some kind of healing or understanding, or something's being worked out in that time. And in faith, in persistence in that, we can experience that, whatever that might mean, if it's a learning how to hold the tension differently, or it is a shift or a change inside. And that story might move from here, a little bit over, so you don't see everything in your life through it. It might even kind of get further out of you until it's over here, you have to turn your head to even see it. But then something may happen in life. Let's say you're pursuing a chaste life. You're single, or you're gay, and you're deciding to just live a celibate life, say. But then your best friend gets married, right? So in some way, it comes right back, right? And again, everything is mediated through that for a season again. And sometimes it can feel like, well, that means I haven't dealt with it well, or I haven't, that didn't count, whatever happened before. But I say, no, it just means that there's a deeper layer. There's another season of that being raw and opened up, because this is the nature of holding those ongoing tensions in relationship. And so there may be movement like this, and we should expect that in our own lives, but with each other, to be how we walk with each other through it.
Right. So, I mean, if we're going to be a people who are like living the way of Jesus in our lives, which is what we're called to do. I mean, what you just said, I think, is so key, that we simply cannot be a place where it's not okay to bring this stuff. Like, if somebody is having a situation, like they're addicted to pornography, like if we can't be the community that's going to bear that, or if they're feeling like they're in the wrong body, gender-wise, like we have to be the people that it is safe to bring that to.
Right.
So like, one thing we can't be is a community of people. Like, there's a lot of questions that remain, obviously, but one thing that I feel like can't be a question, if we're going to be people like Jesus here, like, we've got to be a community that can bear some big stories of tension and walk with people in it and through it, as you said, in that kind of lifetime, that lifetime way. So the church, I think, needs to get a little bit more comfortable with this subject.
Yes, comfortable with the uncomfortable.
And then also, I'm just thinking, too, like, I wouldn't want us to end this conversation without saying again and clearly that Jesus can handle those big sexual tension stories. That's why this is in the Bible. And so we need to hear that invitation to bring it to Jesus, that it's not too big for him. We can't like section off our sexual selves as though that's something that Jesus doesn't have anything to do with, because that shame and all of that is what he redeemed on the cross. Like, if the cross means anything at all, it means that something new can come out of something that feels terribly, terribly broken. And the last thing I just want to say before maybe we close is if there is, our desire here was to not heap shame on anyone who's listening. And like, as Janice was talking about this thing coming back right into focus, I'm guessing that maybe for some of us that even happened in the course of our conversation. So if that's true, like, we both want to invite you to come and tell us about that. If we said something that was hurtful to you, we would love to be able to talk more about that with you. So we did not, our intention is not to make you feel worse about your tension. Mm-hmm. So can we pray?
Yeah.
Jesus, thank you for being one who is both safe and good, one to whom we can bring our all of our brokenness, because you already know it, and you've already borne it, and you've already dealt with it, and you want to invite us into new life. So give us ears to hear your invitation, and give us as a community the grace to sustain others who are struggling and one another in our struggles, so that we might be people who both step out of this issue-driven debate and also step into it in a redemptive, transformative way. Ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.